I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
It is odd how mornings in Oxford still seem to belong to an earlier century. Even now, as I try to recall that particular dawn at St. Erasmus, I remember the mist not as a weather condition, but as a kind of old paper curling at the edges. The porter's lodge smelled of damp wool and pencil shavings. A radio murmured somewhere behind a stack of envelopes, none of it loud enough to disturb the college's sleep. Students drifted past the gate in a slow procession, shoulders hunched under their gowns, faces carrying the wreckage of last night's port. They looked like footnotes wandering free of the text. I had not come with purpose. There was no summons yet, no whisper of a crime, only my own unquiet habit of walking the city before its noise began. The cobbles were slick and the air carried that metallic tang of rain about to happen. My shoes echoed under the archway, and the echo was almost consoling. I paused in the lodge, an idle visitor, and watched the porter slit open an envelope with the precision of a surgeon. He set aside one in pale blue, a delicate, almost antiquated paper, marked urgent, private. His brows drew together as he turned it over, as if the weight of it told him something the address did not. It lay there, unclaimed, like an accusation without a subject. Only later would I learn that the name written across it, Dr. Leonard Vesey, no longer belonged to a living man. At the time it was simply another envelope in a morning's haul, a small mystery that had not yet acquired tragedy. The porter glanced at me, perhaps recognizing a face from the papers, or perhaps only curious. He said softly that the post was late today, and that Dr. Vesey wouldn't be coming for his mail. Then he bent back to his task, a man obedient to routine even when the routine had lost its purpose. I moved on through the cloisters where puddles mirrored the dark arches above. The notice board was pinned with the usual announcements: choral rehearsals, tutorials rescheduled, a debate on Homeric authorship. At the center, someone had fixed a Latin epigram about time and fate. I read it twice, tracing the scuffed glass with a finger. The translation in my head stumbled over the last line. It seemed to offer two meanings, equally plausible. One about the hour's inevitability, the other about its delay. I remember thinking that such ambiguity was a kind of mercy. A student hurried by, muttering into his collar about a misplaced essay. He dropped a folded crossword page, and I picked it up without calling after him. The clue under my thumb read, Silent Muse, 5 letters. The answer came unbidden, errato, but I kept it to myself, a small private completion. It is often in such useless fragments that the first stirrings of a case announce themselves, though at the time one cannot know it. In the quad beyond, pigeons worried at crumbs by the worn statue of Erasmus himself, the philosopher forever holding his book open to the weather. I thought of Vesey, vaguely then, a name I'd heard attached to a paper on Greek fragments, a man described as reclusive, precise, maybe proud. There are many like him scattered through the colleges, scholars who live more fully in footnotes than in conversation. The chapel bell struck the half-hour, and with it came a faint draught of incense from some unseen service. It mingled with the smell of wet stone and old wood polish, producing a scent I can still conjure at will. I stood there longer than necessary, feeling that familiar tug of melancholy, the one that always precedes rather than follows an investigation. It is like hearing the overture before you know the opera. Lewis would later ask me how I could possibly have sensed anything amiss when all I had seen was an envelope and a notice board. I had no answer that would satisfy him. Intuition is not a lamp, but a flicker on the edge of sight. You do not know what it illuminates until you have already walked into its circle. When at last I turned back through the arch, the porter had placed the blue envelope on the counter beside a stack of outgoing mail. He was staring at it as if trying to will the addressee into being. Rain began to thread through the mist, soft and unhurried. I remember tightening my coat, thinking about the epigram's double meaning, the hour's inevitability, or its delay. In that moment, both seemed possible, and both, as it turned out, were true. It was one of those mornings when Oxford looked emptied of colour, the stone drained of its usual honey, as if the city itself wished not to intrude upon grief. The chapel at St. Erasmus seemed smaller than I remembered. The pews pushed close, the air sharp with the scent of damp cassocks and extinguished candles. We had been summoned without ceremony. No obituary yet, no announcement in the Times, only a murmured notice tacked to a board. Even the bell had rung lightly, as though testing the air. I stood at the back with Lewis beside me, our coats still carrying a smell of drizzle. Ahead of us, the mourners were few. A pair of dons whispering about lectures, an elderly librarian whose spectacles hung from a black ribbon, and a student who might have been there by accident. None of them looked like family. The college had provided a simple coffin, pale wood with brass handles, as though Vasey were merely another volume to be shelved. The organ began its slow prelude, a piece I almost recognized but could not place. Its notes did not rise so much as hover, uncertain whether to console or accuse. I remember Lewis leaning closer, his voice low, saying it was strange about that letter arriving the same morning. His eyes flicked towards the coffin, then away. I gave no answer. In cases like this, words are mostly placeholders for what cannot yet be known. At the front, the bursar read from a sheaf of paper. His tone was brisk, efficient. He spoke of Vasey's contributions to the college's reputation, of his long years, cataloguing fragments no one else had the patience for. He did not speak of friends or siblings. When he described the death as a tragic coincidence of timing, the words fell into the chapel like coins into an empty box. I felt, rather than thought, that something in his phrasing was off. A pause in the wrong place, a glance too quickly at the verger. As the service moved on, my eyes wandered over the chapel's details. Dusty hymnals, a spider's thread in the corner of a mullioned window, the faint chalk marks on the floor from a recent choir rehearsal. Beneath the window nearest the coffin stood a vase of lilies whose water had turned slightly cloudy. Someone had left a folded order of service on the ledge. On its margin was scribbled a word, underlined twice. Erato. The same answer to the crossword clue I had filled in yesterday morning. I felt a small tightening behind the eyes. Coincidence, perhaps, but the kind that insists on being noticed. The prayers concluded with a muted Amen. The coffin was wheeled out through a side door, avoiding the main aisle. There was no cortege waiting, no trailing of mourners to a graveside. Vasey was to be interred in the college plot, Lewis whispered, as if secrecy could soften solitude. I watched the door close behind the coffin and thought of all the papers still on his desk, all the fragments of lost poems he had spent his life coaxing back into sense. Outside, rain began to stipple the worn flagstones. The dons dispersed quickly, their gowns lifted against the damp. The librarian wiped her spectacles and vanished into the cloisters. Only the bursar lingered a moment at the chapel door, checking his watch before tucking the sheaf of paper into his coat. His movements were too neat, like a man rehearsing a gesture he wished to look natural. Lewis said quietly that the college wanted the matter settled. No fuss, no headlines. I nodded, but my mind was already turning, not with answers, but with the shape of questions. Why the haste? Why the absence of kin? Why a letter marked urgent arriving after its addressee had gone? In the rain's hush, I thought again of the epigram on the notice board and its two meanings, inevitability or delay. Standing there in my wet coat, I wondered which one had carried Vasey to his grave. I still see that office as it was on the afternoon I first unfolded the blue envelope, the windows fogged by a thin rain, the faint smell of floor polish and stale tobacco clinging to the curtains. Files lay open on the desk, their paper edges curled like petals gone brittle. I had drawn the blinds against the brightness and switched on the lamp, preferring its small circle of light. Outside, a car door slammed, echoing in the courtyard, but in that room time felt withheld. I read the letter once as a policeman, scanning for facts, and again as a man trying to hear a voice already silenced. Its ink had spread slightly where the pen lingered, as if the hand that wrote it trembled or hesitated. The words themselves were an odd mixture of erudition and desperation. Vasey spoke of the second Sappho, a papyrus he had been cataloguing in secret, a fragment of which, he wrote, had been stolen. He did not name the thief, but hinted at someone who knew his past, someone prepared to destroy his reputation. The sentences leaned toward confession without reaching it. One line caught and held me. It was from Sappho, or claimed to be. Yet the phrasing was wrong by a single word. I mouthed it under my breath, feeling the rhythm falter. That misquotation was more than a slip. It was a signal. Vasey, meticulous to the point of obsession, would never misquote a poet he had spent his life deciphering. I turned the page over, then back again, as if some marginal note might appear, only a faint crease along the fold, nothing more. I pushed the letter aside and reached for the crossword Lewis had left on my desk, yesterday's paper, folded in quarters. One clue remained blank. Half-lost voice. 5 letters. I wrote errato without thinking, the answer fitting neatly, and in that small act felt the connection tighten between the letter and the clues scribbled on the funeral order of service. These coincidences form a pattern long before the mind admits it. Lewis arrived as I sat there, damp from the rain, his hair flattened. He said he had been down in the quad, talking to one of the porters. Vasey had been seen there 2 nights before his death, in heated argument with a woman. A lecturer, apparently. Lewis could not recall her name, but described her as sharp-faced, elegant, wearing a dark green scarf. I listened without interrupting, my eyes drifting back to the letter. Green scarf. Misquoted Sappho. A missing papyrus. The facts lay separate like pieces of glass, waiting for light. He asked what the letter said. I told him only that it spoke of something called the second Sappho. He raised an eyebrow, said he had never heard of it. Few had, I replied, and left it at that. My reluctance was not strategy. It was an instinct for silence until the shape of things clarifies. He mentioned that the bursar seemed anxious to have Vasey's rooms cleared. I made a note of that, but said nothing. After he left, the room felt heavier. I read the letter a 3rd time, slower now, tracing each word as though it were a path on an old map. The misquoted line began to echo, its altered word standing like a landmark where none should be. I recalled an old lecture on Greek metrics, how a single syllable misplaced could alter a poem's entire drift. Perhaps Vasey had placed his own signal for whoever found the letter, a breadcrumb or a dare. Rain thickened against the glass, making the lamp's glow warmer by contrast. I leaned back, eyes closed, and imagined Vasey writing those words, sealing the envelope, walking across the quad under the same drizzle, posting it without realizing how little time remained. The image would not leave me. In it there was no fear, only a kind of weary precision. When I opened my eyes, the office had grown dimmer. The letter lay on the desk like a small verdict. I knew almost nothing yet, but the wrong word in a fragment of Sappho had begun to speak louder than any confession. In my work, it is seldom the large facts that shift the case, but the smallest tremor in a line of verse, the hesitation in a hand. That afternoon, with rain on the windows and the smell of paper rising from the desk, the tremor began. The day had thinned into that grey interval between lectures and supper, when the corridors of St. Erasmus grew still enough for their creaks to be heard. I remember climbing the worn staircase to the senior common room, the smell of sherry and scorched toast lingering in the carpet. Interviews, however politely named, are a kind of dissection. You look for the slight tremor when someone thinks they have arranged their face too carefully. Dr. Helena Field was first. She had taken the chair nearest the window, her posture composed, a green scarf looped loosely at her throat. The scarf caught my eye more than her expression, which was of studied impatience. She spoke with the clipped brilliance of someone used to defending her footnotes. She said she had admired Vasey's scholarship, yes, though he had grown difficult in recent years. No, she had not argued with him in the quad. If someone saw her there, it must have been another evening. She smiled faintly as she said this, a smile like a parenthesis. While she talked, I noticed her hands folded too tightly, the knuckles pale, and the faint smear of ink on her left thumb. A sign she had been writing or correcting just before coming here. I stored it away without knowing why. The Reverend Stannard followed. He smelled faintly of port even at that hour, the kind of ecclesiastical indulgence one forgives in Oxford. He praised Vasey's devotion to the truth, but lamented his lack of faith. He claimed to have been in the chapel at evensong on the night in question, an alibi delivered with unhurried certainty. Yet when he recalled the hymn they had sung, he stumbled, substituting a Miltonic line for the actual verse. I did not correct him. A misremembered hymn is nothing in itself, but in that moment it felt like the echo of the misquoted Sappho in the letter, a second, subtler discord. Malcolm Price was last, a young man with the anxious neatness of a scholar who knows his future depends on other men's papers. His answers were careful, almost rehearsed. He had been in his room working on a draft. He had no knowledge of any missing papyrus. He admitted that Vasey had once threatened to withdraw access to his notes, but claimed it had all been resolved. His gaze slid away when he spoke of it, not with guilt, but with the weary caution of someone already imagining a disciplinary board. Throughout these conversations, Lewis remained mostly silent at the edge of the room, making occasional notes. The senior common room itself felt complicit. Portraits of past fellows leaning down with their muted judgments, the fire snapping softly in its grate. On the table near the door lay the register of visitors, a heavy leather-bound book with pages like parchment. I opened it idly as the Reverend and Price exchanged a few words. Names marched neatly down the page, donors, old pupils, minor dignitaries. But one entry near the bottom had been scratched out with deliberate pressure, the ink gouged into a blur. The date beside it matched the night before, Vasey's death. I traced the indentation with my thumb, feeling the grooves rather than seeing them. Someone had not merely crossed a name but erased it, as though presence itself could be undone. I asked the porter later about the entry and received only a shrug. No one, he said, ever looks at the register. That was true enough. Almost no one does, which is why it is so revealing when someone tries to hide within it. As I left the common room, the bell for dinner began its low call. Helena Field had already gone, her green scarf a last flicker at the end of the corridor. Stannard lingered by the mantel, swirling a glass he had not yet tasted. Price pretended to study the notice board. The smell of old wood and ash pressed close around them all. I walked back into the quadrangle, feeling the evening's damp rise from the stones. Interviews, like poems, do not yield their meaning at first reading. But already the pattern was there, faint as an erased name, waiting for the right light. I can still feel the hush of that library as it was that night. A hush thicker than silence, a presence that pressed against the ears. Midnight at St. Erasmus is not like midnight anywhere else. The stones hold their breath. The air is powdered with centuries of dust and exhaled scholarship. Lewis had phoned me earlier to say that one of the restricted manuscripts had been removed the night before Vasey died. No sign of forced entry. CCTV had captured only a wavering shape at the edge of the lens, like an afterimage rather than a person. He sounded frustrated, as though the cameras owed him clarity. I told him to go home, that I would walk the aisles myself. The porter let me in with a look of mild curiosity. The key turned reluctantly, its squeal echoing into the vaulted darkness. Inside, the smell was the same as when I had been a student haunting libraries after hours. Paper, leather, a faint medicinal tang of polish. I left the main lights off and walked by the glow of a single reading lamp, its circle of gold floating ahead of me like a portable memory. The aisles seemed narrower than they had in daylight. Tall shelves rose like black cliffs, and the titles, in gilt or faded ink, flickered briefly before vanishing into shadow. My fingers drifted along the spines, a habit more intimate than deliberate. Each touch called up something half forgotten, lectures I had never attended, books I had once meant to read. I thought of my own, discarded thesis on Sophoclean irony, how I had folded it away like an old map, turning instead toward the police force. There was no romance in that choice, only a slow retreat from a world where one is always too late. In the special collections room, a single chair had been left askew, its felt seat showing the ghost of recent weight. The catalogue lay open, but unsigned. A small red light blinked from a camera in the corner. Recording, perhaps, but seeing nothing. Someone had been careful. Someone always is. I took a slow circuit of the room, noting trivialities because sometimes they aren't. A faint scuff on the parquet near the locked cabinet. A residue of candle wax on the sill, though candles were forbidden. The temperature a degree colder than in the main hall. These details gathered at the edge of thought like iron filings near a magnet, not yet forming a picture, but already leaning toward one. At the far end of a shelf devoted to Greek lyric poets, a folio protruded slightly as though replaced in haste. I eased it out. The leather was dry, its clasp bent. When I opened it, a slip of paper slid free and drifted to the floor. I bent and picked it up. It was half a library slip, torn diagonally, with a margin scribble in a pencil. Silent Muse, 5 letters. The handwriting was small. Precise. I stared at it, hearing again the crossword clue in my mind, the one I'd solved automatically. Erato, a pattern tightening, though its shape was still hidden. I put the slip back between the pages and closed the folio. The air in the room felt charged, like a breath drawn, but not yet released. For a moment I imagined Vasey standing where I stood, the letter already sealed, his mind on fragments of poetry, while someone else's hand reached for the same shelf. The image refused to settle. It flickered between guilt and innocence, scholar and thief. Downstairs, the clock struck the quarter hour, a sound swallowed quickly by the walls. I stayed a little longer, letting my eyes adjust, letting the shelves loom back into meaning. The library had always been my favorite kind of crime scene. No blood, only paper, no weapons, only words. Yet in its quiet, it offered the same truth as any alleyway. That what is hidden prefers the dark, and that every erasure leaves an outline. When at last I left, locking the door behind me, the slip with its cryptic plea burned in my pocket like a small, persistent pulse. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the stones still shone as though recently washed. I walked slowly across the quad, feeling the damp seep through my shoes, thinking of how a muse can be silent yet still speak if one knows where to listen. The pub near Jericho had the kind of evening light I prefer. Brass dulled by cigarette ghosts, a bar mirror softened by years of breath. Rain tapped the window panes with the patience of a metronome. I chose a corner table beneath a crooked print of the Cherwell. The claret arrived sullen and excellent, a ruby that promised candour from its drinkers. Stannard kept his collar on, which in a pub is a form of theatre. He thanked me for the glass as if blessings could be reciprocal, then settled with a practiced sigh. He said he was sorry about Vasey, that scholarship can be a kind of loneliness. The Lord had chosen a gentler library. I let the Reverend use his phrases. Grief loves inherited vocabulary. I asked about the evening Vasey died. He said he had been in the chapel for evensong. He described a small congregation, the air faint with lilies, a novice struggling with the psalm. He named the hymn, and his voice took on confidence, as if memory were a moral act. Yet the lines he recited were not a hymn. They were Milton, when I consider how my light is spent. Delivered with gravity. I let it drift across the table like a draught no one admits feeling. He asked whether we intended to pursue theft. I said we were considering many possibilities. He nodded, relieved, and spoke about temptation and the burden of genius. It sounded like sermon notes trying on secular clothes. While he talked, I watched his hands. Clean, pink at the tips, a streak of candle grease along the nail of the ring finger. Candlelight in the chapel, then. Yet the college forbids it except at feast days. Perhaps a private devotion, perhaps not. The claret grew better as the glass lowered. I asked whether he had seen Dr. Helena Field that week. He considered, said that scholars moved like weather. One noticed them only when they thundered. He smiled in a way meant to compliment and absolve. I thought of the green scarf and the scratched-out name in the register. In Oxford, erasure is never the end. It is a palimpsest awaiting patience. Lewis found us halfway through the bottle, damp and apologetic. He said he had rung my office and been told I was listening to ecclesiastical wisdom. Then he produced the kind of fact that makes junior officers look older. A deposit into Malcolm Price's account 3 days before Vasey died. Not lavish, but helpful to a postgraduate. The bank had not yet said from whom. Price had paid 2 months' rent in one cheerful transaction. Stannard heard none of this. He had got up to speak to the landlord about a parish raffle and did not return. I watched his empty glass reflect the pub's amber light like a small reddened window. 2 paths opened obligingly. On the left, Price, eager, needy, and now inexplicably solvent. On the right, the chaplain with his candle-greased finger, and Milton posed as him. Both roads signposted with motive, both attractive to anyone craving closure. I told Lewis it was good work and useless. He asked, why useless? Because each answer had arrived too early, I said, and truth dislikes punctuality as much as deceit. We walked through the rain to the car in a silence that had the comfort of an old coat. I thought about the letter's misquotation, Stannard's echo of it, the soft glamour of money arriving like mercy. The city smelled of yeast and wet stone. Somewhere a choir rehearsed the wrong anthem. In the rearview mirror, the pub's windows dwindled into small rubies, then were gone. I felt that familiar ache, no noble despair, just the quiet disappointment of intellect withheld. Utterly. 2 paths, I told myself, and neither yet the road. The case would dislike being hurried. So, for once, would I. I remember the night of the sting as one of those damp Oxford evenings when the city itself seems to have conspired in your certainty. The mist had thickened around the lampposts on Holywell Street, softening their halos to a painter's blur. I sat in an unmarked car outside the student lodgings, window half open, smelling rain on stone and cheap detergent from some unseen laundry room. I'd persuaded myself of Price's guilt with the slow hunger of a man who wishes for an ending. We had arranged it quietly. No uniforms, no flashing lights. Lewis waited in the hallway, his weight shifting on the creaking boards. I remained in the car, watching the door where the shadows of bicycles lay tangled like lines of Greek verse. When the porter let us in at last, his keys jingled too brightly. It was just past 11. Price's room was as I had imagined it, papers stacked like battlements, an electric kettle glowing sullenly in the corner, the smell of instant coffee, unwashed wool, and fear. He looked younger than his file photograph, the way scholars do when their citadels crumble. Lewis asked the questions softly. I stayed back, letting the boy look at me as little as possible. He said he had taken nothing. Then, pressed, he admitted to copying Vasey's notes, to selling those copies to an unnamed intermediary, who promised introductions and perhaps a stipend. He swore he had never touched the papyrus itself. His eyes were wet, but not from tears, rather from the kind of shame that does not yet know its name. We found the photocopies neatly hidden in a folder under his bed. They looked almost theatrical, labeled and cross-referenced, ready for a courtroom prop. A confession arrived with them, stumbling yet strangely polished. He spoke of desperation, of debts, of Vesey's threats to cut him off. The story fit too well, like a coat tailored from rumors. I should have felt satisfaction. Instead, there was that hollowness, the echo of a solved crossword whose last clue comes too easily. Price's posture, the timing, even the quantity of money in his account. All of it arranged itself into an answer that felt rehearsed by someone else. Back in the senior common room the following afternoon, Helena Field drifted toward me with a glass of sherry. Her green scarf had been replaced by one of pale grey, which somehow sharpened her smile. "So you have your thief," she said, voice low enough to pass for sympathy. I inclined my head. She congratulated me on resolving the case, the word resolving sliding from her tongue like a blade into water. I watched her hands, free of ink this time, resting lightly on the back of a chair. Lewis stood at the window, describing the paperwork to come. I heard him distantly, like a radio left on in another room. My gaze had fallen on a railway ticket tucked beneath a brass paperweight on the bursar's desk. A ticket I had glimpsed before in Vesey's file, but had not studied. The date printed in faint purple figures jarred against what Price had claimed. Not a large contradiction, barely a tremor, but enough to shift the architecture of my certainty. I picked up the ticket, turning it between my fingers as though feeling for Braille. A day later than the supposed theft, or a day earlier. The ambiguity of ink rubbed by time. Such discrepancies are usually nothing, yet I have learned they are sometimes the crack in the fresco through which the real color seeps. Helena asked if I felt relief. I said something evasive about justice being incremental. She laughed, the sound bright and almost kind. When she left, the room felt cooler, as though a door had been opened to a corridor of draughts. That night, alone in my flat, I poured a whiskey and laid the photocopies across the table. The rain on the window was heavier now, erasing the streetlights into blurred commas. I read Price's confession again, searching for the word out of place, the syllable that didn't scan. Somewhere in the stack lay the detail that would rearrange the case, as a single misquote had already begun to rearrange my sense of Vesey's last hours. Outside, the bells of St. Barnabas tolled the hour. Inside, the room smelled of paper and malt, of patience and its cost. The case had given me an answer, but not the truth. It was late afternoon when the call came, the kind of hour when Oxford turns brass-colored and the streets seem briefly to belong to their ghosts. The antiquarian bookseller spoke in the cautious voice of someone who handles fragile things. He said a postcard had been slipped into a volume of Greek fragments left for valuation. Unsigned, no return address, but the script resembled the urgent letter I had shown him weeks earlier. He thought I might want to see it before it went wherever such things go. I walked to his shop through a drizzle that was more like a remembered mist than weather. The bell above the door gave a single thin chime. Inside smelled of old bindings, cedar polish, and a faint trace of pipe smoke. He led me to a glass case at the back, his fingers trembling slightly as he unlocked it. The postcard lay on a scrap of felt, a photograph of a sun-bleached ruin on one side, words cramped across the other, merely a reference to the second Sappho and a date. The hand was unmistakable, the same deliberate curves and sudden slashes as Vesey's final plea. I turned the card under the lamp. The ink had seeped into the grain, making the letters blur their edges like thoughts on the verge of confession. At the bottom, faint but legible, a postmark from a village I did not know. The bookseller, seeing my hesitation, said softly that the village lay on the edge of the Cotswolds, where the sister used to live. He had dealt with her once, long ago, over a set of Pindar. She had seemed, he said, almost relieved to part with them. The road out of Oxford was slick with rain. Fields blurred past, hedges dark with water, a single heron rising from a flooded ditch. I drove slowly, letting the wipers trace a rhythm to my thoughts. Vesey's sister had been a rumour in the file, estranged, address uncertain. Now her cottage waited at the end of a narrowing lane. The place stood hunched against a line of bare trees, stone walls the colour of old parchment. A gate hung crooked, squealing faintly as I pushed it open. No one answered my knock. Inside, the air was cold enough to mist my breath, carrying the smell of closed rooms. Lavender gone dry, soot, paper that has not been touched in years. Dust had settled on every surface, like fine ash. I moved slowly from room to room, my footsteps soft on the warped boards. Books leaned against each other on low shelves, their spines faded. A cracked teacup on the mantel still held a ring of dried brown. No photographs on display, only blank hooks on the wall. Yet on a small table by the window lay a shoebox of loose papers. I opened it. Letters mostly, the ink faded, envelopes unsealed. At the bottom, an old photograph curled at the corners. 2 figures in sun-bleached hats, standing before a trench of pale stone. Vesey, younger by decades, Helena beside him, her hand shading her eyes. They were smiling with the ease of people who believe time is still theirs. The print had been folded once, then smoothed again, leaving a white scar across their faces. I held it longer than necessary, noticing small things. Helena's scarf in the photograph was patterned with the same motif as the green one she had worn in the common room. Vesey's notebook tucked under his arm bore a corner stain like the one on the missing papyrus slip. These details flickered, but did not yet cohere. Rain began on the cottage roof, a soft percussion. I slipped the photograph back into the box and closed it gently. In the silence that followed, I thought of how scholars write footnotes to lives they cannot finish, and how sometimes those footnotes outlive the text. The cottage smelled of that kind of persistence. Driving back, the lane narrowed to a tunnel of dripping branches. The photograph lay on the passenger seat, heavier than paper. A muse can be silent, I thought, but the past rarely is. The rain had followed me home like a stray thought. It clung to the sill, streaking the window in thin diagonal threads while the streetlight outside flickered against the glass. Inside, my flat held its usual half-light, the faint smell of malt and old paper. I set the kettle aside without filling it and let the music start instead. An aria from Mozart, soft enough to seem like memory rather than sound. The letter lay on the table where I had left it days before, its blue paper dulled by repetition. I unfolded it again, not as an officer, but as a man reading a confession he had missed the first time. The misquoted Sappho had kept me awake through the night at the cottage, a small burr in the mind. Now, under the lamp, the lines appeared different. They no longer felt like missteps. They felt deliberate, like footsteps leading somewhere. I took a pencil and ran it down the margin, marking the first letter of each line. Slowly, without hurry, the name emerged, H, then E, then L. The room seemed to tilt as the rest followed. Helena, a hidden signature disguised as a slip of scholarship. The neatness of it, the vanity, even the desperation, made a strange music of its own beneath the opera. I thought of her smile in the senior common room, the soft congratulation, the grey scarf replacing the green. She had posted the letter too late, hoping it would point me to Price, to his eagerness, his photocopies. It had. I had been led like a student following footnotes. She had counted on my hunger for a pattern and given me one to swallow. The aria reached a high note and hovered there. In its pause, Lewis knocked once and entered without waiting. He carried the smell of wet stone and a faint impatience. He asked what I was doing alone with the letter again. I tilted it toward him. "Look at the first letters," I said. He bent, lips moving as he traced them. "Bloody clever," he muttered at last, and shook his head. I almost smiled, though the smile felt borrowed. We sat without speaking for a moment. Outside, a bus hissed past on the wet road. Inside, the only sound was the needle of rain and the muted swell of the aria. I poured a measure of whiskey into a glass and watched its amber catch the lamp's light. The act steadied my hands. Lewis asked what it meant. I said only that the case was not over. He wanted more, but I let silence settle between us like dust. The truth, when it begins to show itself, prefers to arrive slowly. He leaned back, looking at the walls lined with books I had never quite finished, and said he'd always wondered why I kept working cases after dark. I thought of Vasey's photograph with Helena at the excavation, both smiling into the Greek sun. I thought of the candle grease on Stannard's finger, the erased name in the register, the railway ticket whose date still refused to align. All of it rearranged itself in the mind's quiet theatre, actors taking new positions. The opera moved into its final bars, a descending figure that always felt like resignation. I read the letter again, the hidden name now glowing like an afterimage behind the words. Price had been too obvious, too available. Helena had written her signature inside a misquoted poet, trusting that only a scholar would notice, and even then, too late. Lewis rose, muttering about paperwork. He paused at the door and asked if I'd be all right. I nodded. He left. The flat returned to Nantes, its earlier solitude. I let the aria finish and fade into the hiss of the stylus. Alone, I folded the letter once more, pressing the crease with my thumb. The rain against the window slowed, each drop distinct. I had almost everything now but the ending, and endings, like fragments, rarely come when summoned. The cloisters at St. Erasmus always seemed to hold more air than their size allowed, a resonant emptiness where footsteps echoed like half-forgotten arguments. Dusk found me there, the light sliding off the stone into long blue streaks. I had asked Helena to meet me without telling her why. The college bells had just finished their reluctant chime. The quad lay quiet except for a few pigeons shifting on the statue's head. I waited by a column worn smooth by centuries of leaning. She arrived with no hurry, her scarf a muted grey now, the colour of unsaid things. She did not ask why I had summoned her. Her eyes travelled the arches, then returned to me as though we were merely two colleagues about to discuss a paper. She said she had expected this sooner. I told her it had taken me longer to read her letter than she had meant it to. She gave a small sound, not quite a laugh. She said Vasey had threatened to reveal her appropriation of his research on the papyrus, that what had begun as collaboration had soured into rivalry and then contempt. She spoke of a night of laudanum and rage, the words flat, as if she had filed their edges down before bringing them here. She said his death had not been planned, that she had tried to protect her career, not end his life. I asked about the letter. She said she had posted it, hoping to implicate Price, that she had miscalculated the delivery and could not retrieve it once it had gone. The confession arrived like an academic footnote, precise, bloodless, yet quietly damning. Her voice echoed off the arches and came back softer, as though the building itself doubted her. While she spoke, I noticed small things. A smudge of dust on the hem of her coat, the faint smell of candle smoke in her hair, and a railway ticket protruding from her notebook, its date matching the night Vasey died. She did not see me see it. These details arranged themselves like the opening moves of a puzzle whose end is known but not yet visible. I asked whether she regretted anything. She said regret was a luxury of those who had nothing left to lose. The words were not defensive. They were simply another fact. She placed her hands on the cold stone of the balustrade, fingers pale against the darkening cloister, and for a moment looked like a figure carved into the architecture. The evening deepened. The first drops of rain began to stipple the flagstones, each one a small, dark coin. She said she had loved Vasey once, that in the photograph at the excavation they had been still friends, still believing in the permanence of fragments. She said he had been brilliant but careless with people, and that she had been no better. Her tone carried neither plea nor apology, only the low register of a scholar reciting a conclusion already reached. I told her nothing of warrants or charges. This was not an interrogation, but a moment suspended before consequence. Lewis waited elsewhere with the necessary papers, but I had wanted this interval, not for justice, but for understanding, if that word still had weight. She asked what would happen now. I said only that the truth had been patient, but not idle. She closed her eyes briefly, as if listening to an inward aria, then opened them and gave a small nod. When she turned to walk away, the arches swallowed her footsteps until there was only the rain and my own breathing. The cloisters smelled of wet stone and ancient paper, like a library left open to the weather. I stayed there a long while, feeling the echo of her words dissipate into the dusk. The railway ticket still burned in my memory, a small unclaimed proof, and I wondered whether any of us truly miscalculate the hour of delivery. They took her without ceremony. No handcuffs, no raised voices, only the small shuffle of shoes across the flagstones. Lewis led her out by the side door while the porter pretended to rearrange prayer books. The evening light through the stained glass made their shadows seem taller than they were, as if history itself were escorting her away. She did not look back at me. I stayed in the chapel after they had gone. The door closed with a hush like the turning of a page. Above me the organ pipes rose into darkness, silent as sentries. The air had a faint tang of wax and damp linen. A single lamp glowed near the altar, casting thin ribs of light across the floor. We had found the papyrus, where she said nothing about it being. Lewis, climbing the organ loft with his usual unshowy patience, had reached into a hollow behind the pipes and drawn out a hymnal swollen by moisture. Inside it lay the fragment, folded as delicately as a pressed flower. For all its age, it looked newly hidden, the ink still crisp where Vasey's notes had ended mid-line. That such a thing could pass from Greek sand to Oxford stone only to vanish in a loft seemed fitting, a parable for our kind of scholarship and our kind of crime. I had watched Lewis wrap it in archival paper, his fingers careful despite the hour. He had said quietly that it was a shame. I did not ask which part he meant. Now, and alone, I walked to the lectern where the urgent letter had lain unread, the wood worn smooth by generations of elbows and salters. Rain ticked faintly against the high windows. The chapel smelled older than the college, as if each prayer had left a thin sediment. I rested a hand on the lectern and thought of second chances and how they so often arrive too late to be taken. Helena's letter, the scratched-out name, the misquoted poet. All signals sent toward redemption, yet intercepted by timing. Knowledge and desire had entangled like vines in this case, each choking the other. A hymnal lay open on the pew nearest me. Someone had underlined a line from a Victorian hymn, its pencil mark faint but deliberate. The tune leapt to mind unbidden, and I hummed it under my breath, the sound echoing back a tone, lower. It was the same hymn Stannard had misremembered as Milton. Only now did I see the underlining formed the initials HF in the margin, as if she had left a signature here long before we found the papyrus. A small deduction, perhaps meaningless, but it tightened the case's weave one last notch. I sat down in the back pew. The stone beneath me was cold enough to make the body ache. Through the archway, I could glimpse the organ loft where the fragment had slept above the congregation all this time, a relic listening to music. I poured a measure of thought over the affair like whiskey into a glass. Vasey's scholarly vanity, Helena's desperation, Price's eagerness, my own readiness to be led by a neat solution. The fragments of Sappho spoke of eros and silence, their interpreters of ownership and blame. Perhaps the papyrus itself was innocent. Perhaps we all were once. The lamp at the altar flickered. I closed my eyes and let the sound of rain merge with the faint hum of the pipes, as though the organ still held an aftertone of hymns. In that blend of echo and water, I heard the case settling, not ending, just sinking into memory, like ink into paper. When at last I rose, the chapel was darker than before, the outlines of benches fading into shadow. I touched the lectern once more, as one touches a door frame on leaving a childhood house, and walked toward the exit. The hinges sighed. Outside, the quad smelled of wet grass and stone. I did not look back. Weeks later, I found myself once more at St. Erasmus, not summoned, merely passing through. The air had lost winter's bite and carried a faint, chalky warmth from the lecture halls. In the quad, the grass was newly cut, and the stone smelled almost clean, like wet parchment left to dry in sunlight. I had no business there, or perhaps I had unfinished business of a kind that does not earn a file. Students crossed the square in loose knots, their laughter a quick music under the arches. They were the same age Price had been, though none of them wore his fretfulness. Some held books pressed flat to their chests. Others scrolled on glowing screens as they walked. A girl stopped to read the notice board and smiled before moving on. I drifted closer. Where the old epigram had hung, the one about time and fate with its double meaning, a new poem had been pinned in fresh typeface. It was Sappho again, but this time quoted correctly. No missing syllable, no altered word. I traced the first letters of each line with my finger, a reflex I could not resist. They spelled nothing but themselves. No hidden name, only the poem as it was meant to stand, intact, self-sufficient. Lewis had come with me at first, but now hurried off toward the gates. He muttered something about a football, match, a friend with a spare ticket. I told him to go, that I would catch up later. He hesitated, then left at a jog, his coat flaring like a dark pennant. Watching him vanish through the arch, I felt an unaccustomed stillness settle over the quad. My hand remained on the cold stone of the notice board frame. The chill moved slowly into my palm, up the tendons of my arm. The bells in the chapel began to chime the quarter hour. Not urgent, merely present. Their sound filled the space where Lewis's footsteps had been. I thought of the urgent letter that had arrived too late, its blue paper dulled by travel and timing. I thought of Helena's grey scarf dissolving into the cloisters, of Vaizey's papyrus folded like a pressed flower above the organ loft, of Price's neat confession offered like a gift he did not believe in. Letters that arrive too late, lives that do the same. The thought had no drama to it, only a kind of sediment settling slowly. A hymn sheet lay on the bench below the bore, left from some rehearsal. I picked it up, glanced at the margins. No initials, no crossword clues, only a small ink blot where a note had been held too long. It was absurd how my eyes still sought patterns, even now when the case was over and filed. Habit outlasts resolution. The students' laughter rose again at the far end of the quad. Someone dropped a book, stooped, picked it up without breaking stride. Above them, the sky held a pale spring light, the color of old vellum. I stayed where I was. The bells finished their chime and left a silence that was not empty but layered, like paper with faint writing beneath. My hand did not move from the stone. The cold of it steadied me, as if confirming that something had ended, or at least paused. I did not look at the chapel door. I did not think of warrants or verdicts, only of fragments and how some remain fragments even when pieced together. I stayed until the last echo faded, then breathed once, shallow and slow. The bells would strike again soon enough, but for the moment the quad belonged to its own soundless interval. I did not move.